Right. So, the Sex Pistols, the mythological Sex Pistols. The hardest thing about doing research on the Sex Pistols, guys, is there's 1,000 stories about the Sex Pistols, which may or may not be true. And there's every single story about the Sex Pistols is largely with, this could be true or this could just be, and everybody's weighing in, and the band members are often contradicting each other in the same stories that are being told. Man. And then sometimes they have the same story and journalists are contradicting them. And that was a little bit of what by design they were, because I think the thing you have to know about the Sex Pistols is what we may think of as like the punk rock look, and to some degree the punk rock sound. The sound was, coming from stuff like Patti Smith, right? And, the Stooges before that, the Ramones, that all predates the Sex Pistols. So maybe not the sound exactly, but the way they played, taking that sound and producing it, but also the look. And one thing to know is the Sex Pistols were as much designed for their look and their cultural relevance as they were like as a band. And that's why some people will in some ways say the Sex Pistols were almost formed in the way that like a boy band was formed.
Yeah.
In a very different way, because they were the real item, right? Like these were not just people that were, hey, go play a punk. These were people that were absolutely products of that very tumultuous time in Great Britain that we've talked about a little bit with the Clash and Wire and stuff. I mean, mid to late 70s Great Britain, not a very fun place if you were not sort of affluent. Lots of working class folks who were traditionally not served in the music scene, sort of bursting their way through from, I guess, what the early and mid 70s sort of represented in British rockers, right? Like a more genteel, arty viewpoint. Yeah, as we go to the late 70s, right? We're starting to see the rebellion of the middle class here. So I'll try to cut down the Sex Pistols into, I guess, the best I could do to do bullet points, but I apologize in advance. There's going to be about 1,000 nuggets that I'm sure people will share in the comments. And they will all be true, and I will have probably read all of these things, but I can only share so many if I don't want to go 2 hours on this segment.
Well, before you go into it, John, let me read some numbers here before you get in the nitty-gritty there. Mm-hmm. So this is number 30 in the 1970s on Best Ever Albums, number 5 in 1977, number 114 of all time, and in Rolling Stone's list, it comes in at number 80.
Wow. Okay. So they were formed in London in 1975. They are considered the forerunners of the British punk movement. In fact, other bands like the Buzzcocks and Wire, who we talked about in The Clash, all were directly either spurred to make music that sounded like punk or post-punk, or were spurred to start their own band. And they were also, most of these bands that we just talked about and others were playing behind the Sex Pistols, with the Sex Pistols headlining. Susie and the Banshees, Susie Sue was actually in, like a huge super fan of the Sex Pistols, so she was sort of part of their entourage a little bit, so that's a connection there as well. So their footprints are like all over the punk scene. Billy Idol was another person who was a fan of this group. He would later go on to form a punk band called Generation X, and also would play with two members of the Sex Pistols in like a sort of a super band later as well. So these are all people floating around in that scene at that time. Their career lasted a grand total of 2.5 years. They did reunite in 1996 for a reunion tour. Obviously sans Sid Vicious, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The original band, and depending on who you believe who played on this album, were Johnny Lydon, who goes by Rotten at this point. He started as Johnny Lydon and would return to being Johnny Lydon later when he's in Public Image Limited. But at this point, he's Johnny Rotten because of his rotten teeth is what they that's where the name came from. Guitarist Steve Jones, drummer Paul Cook, and the original bassist Glenn Matlock. Contrary to popular belief, Sid Vicious actually only potentially plays on one song on this album. He doesn't come into the band until early 1977. There's talk that Jones is actually the bassist on this album as well, with some people even saying that sort of energizes the sound of this album. Johnny Rotten says that Glenn Matlock basically was a studio player and played a lot more than people give him credit. That's a long way of saying that there's a lot of mythology around who's on this album, who isn't on this album. It's cobbled together from pieces. It had a lot of post-pro and stuff as well. I'll get into that a little bit later. The embers of this band start with 1972. It's a band called The Strand. And at that point, Jones and Cook are playing together with some other musicians. There's no Matlock and there's no Lydon and or Rotten, depending on what you want to go. I'll probably go with Rotten going forward in terms of name. And it was claimed by Jones that band was playing instruments that were stolen. So that was initially that was a little bit of punk right off the bat. I guess the most important thing to know is that you've got to talk about Malcolm Mclaren. Now, have you guys ever heard about Malcolm Mclaren
we
before?
Talked
I did
about
mention him briefly in New York Dolls.
Yeah,
we talked about him with the Clash too. I think you brought him up in there in the Clash episode.
An associate of Malcolm Mclaren, yes, was
right.
responsible for breaking the Clash. Yeah, being their manager. But so Malcolm Mclaren was a gentleman who owned a store in England. The store eventually was renamed Sex. I think it was sort of like a S&M / retro culture store. It sort of billed itself as anti-fashion. So McLaren sort of fashioned himself. When I read it, it's not exactly the same, but he's got like some Andy Warhol type tendencies where it's as much about like the creation of a scene and collecting the energy, right, and the aesthetic. And the music is important, but it's part of the larger aesthetic. At least that is the sort of the viewpoint that he puts forward. And there is some anecdotal evidence that he was definitely very responsible for the band's style, but also the publicity they courted. They really were experts at getting publicity. The other members of the Sex Pistols have sort of gone out of their way to sort of minimize his effects because he's a little bit of a difficult guy to know, but also so are all of them, and they're all not very big on giving the others credit, right? They kind of, for every quote you hear about them talking as a collective, they also are sort of sniping at each other along the time, and to the point where you never really know, are they dead serious or are they sort of playing it for controversy? So the band members of the group, including Sid Vicious and some of the others, they all hung out at these two clothing shops. They were named Acme Attractions and then the Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, which later becomes the Sex Store. There's a lot of stuff that blends together, so I'll try to go slow here because it's kind of high concept, right? So in 1972, the store gets a look that's like the 50s rocker look that, you know, Marlon Brando, Josh, was sort of sporting. If you remember that aesthetic.
Like the Misfits type of movie. Or the
kind of, yeah. And we've talked a little bit, and we will talk later more about how those subcultures in England are a big deal, whereas we look at them sort of as more the clothes you wear and sort of loose things. It was really like a lifestyle, things like being a mod or a rocker, or, you know, in this case, later, a punk, right? Stuff like that. They kind of are grabbing onto the trends and the sort of the underground, and eventually those trends sort of become infused into what would become the punk rock look. And that's sort of all the things from the you know, the bright colored hair, the colors, sort of the everything when you see a Sex Pistols shirt, right? Or like the mohawks, all that stuff, that aesthetic, right? The London Underground, the idea of what we think of when we think of a stereotypical punk, right? Well, at any point in early 1974, Steve Jones asked McLaren to manage the Strand, the original band. McLaren agrees, and he pays for a rehearsal space. And they bring in a guy named Glenn Matlock to be the bassist. McLaren temporarily relocates to New York City at one point, where he's sort of delving into, you know, doing some stuff with the New York Dolls, which is a whole nother episode that we could talk about at another time. But they like after trying to reinvent the New York Dolls, the sound after the album we covered, it was sort of a wildly unsuccessful endeavor. He returns to London in May 1975, and he had sort of seen the punk scene in Manhattan that the Ramones are sort of scraping out, but also the New York Dolls. There's a gentleman by the name of Richard Hell. I don't know how much you guys know about him, but he's sort of floating around that scene too.
Oh,
and
Dick
he
Hell?
decides
Yeah,
that,
I know him.
You got it. Yep. So he's kind of like he's kind of reinvented himself as like a DJ and like just yeah. So I don't know if you're being funny or not.
I was.
I think
I
he was
don't
being
know.
funny. Dick Hell, yeah.
He's kind of like he's kind of like a personality in his own way. It's hard to explain. He's got like he's got a show on Sirius that does.
I actually think I have heard of him. I think
Oh,
that's
he's still around. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh yeah. He does a show. It's always funny because he mentions baseball a lot on it, which always kind of cracks me up. Like it's weird. So anyway, long story short, the band starts rehearsing. Jones is the front man. He does not love being the front man, so he moves to guitar. Mclaren's trying to find the perfect lead singer for this group, and he goes to Sylvain of the New York Dolls, and he says no thanks. He goes to the aforementioned Richard Hell, who also says no thanks, and then he finds Johnny Rotten, who's at this point 19 years old. And a story that everybody tells, so this one I think is absolutely true and is phenomenal, is that how he is found is that Mclaren is basically just going up to people on the street at some point who have a look to them and kind of saying, do you want to sing? And they're like, whatever. And he goes up to him, and I guess Lydon is there. But the thing that drew him to him was he had a Pink Floyd t-shirt on, and he'd clipped on I Hate above Pink Floyd, handwritten above it, and that was what drew him to it, which I've always heard the story. It always makes me laugh every time I say it, and it's like the perfect Sex Pistols story when you think about it too, because of course the fucking Sex Pistols hate Pink Floyd. Like, it's
right.
just built to be it, right? So, he goes and does a rehearsal, which is him singing I'm 18 by Alice Cooper, which is such an odd choice of a song, over a jukebox. He's apparently pretty awful to the point where the other band members kind of laugh, but Mclaren says I see something in this guy, and the other band I guess agrees. And like everything in this scene, it's remarkable how fast everything went from like forming to like this album. So their first gig is in November of 1975. They start the gig by playing covers. It's a remarkable, like, they play Substitute by The Who, which it's actually a pretty awesome cover if you hear it on like odds and ends. And then they do I'm Not Your Stepping Stone by the Monkees. They do What You Gonna Do About It by the Small Faces. And actually the plug gets pulled before they can play their original stuff. And pretty much everybody who's there said they were pretty rough in terms of how they sounded. Now, contrary to popular belief, people who saw them later and people working with them in the studio said, yeah, there's that idea of like punk people, can't play their instruments. And in the case of Sid Vicious, it was pretty true. But they said, by about 6 months to a year later, the Sex Pistols were a pretty tight outfit, and they sounded good live. So the idea that like they couldn't play and didn't sort of have like, an energy or like stuff like that.
They always say that about the Ramones too, right, John? That they can't really play their instruments. Or
they would always say that they played a dumbed down version of it, 3 chords and stuff. But most people usually said that the Ramones could be the Ramones really well, but they're not virtuoso musicians, and I don't think they'd agree with that. But the Sex Pistols, early they stunk, but everybody who saw them later is like, no, listen, they were like a legitimate tight outfit by the time they were in the studio. So that is something that comes up quite a bit. They play relentlessly. They gig at other points with that, as I mentioned before. The Clash and the Buzzcocks play with them. Rotten claims that the Ramones had little to no influence on them, which I find hard to believe because the sound there is a direct line to that to some degree. He does have some funny lines. He, in April 23rd, 19 1976, the Ramones the debut album is released, and here's Johnny Rotten's take. He says, "The Ramones were all long-haired and of no interest to me. I didn't like their image, what they stood for, or anything about them. They were hilarious, but you can only go so far with duh, dur, dur, duh. I've heard it, next, move on." That's his take right there. So there's a lot of great there's a lot of quotes from all of them that are pretty remarkable. The Pistols signed with EMI, the record label, in late 1976. They signed to a 2-year contract, and they begin to just go on a seemingly never-ending array of like debauchery, publicity stunts, general assholery, I would say. I mean,
Anarchy.
there's just like time after time events. Like, just to give you a couple, they most notably went on like a show called Today in England in December 1st of 1976. The host, I guess, who later said that he was a little bit, three sheets to the wind, was on there. I guess he made a comment about Susie Sue, who was there, and they start swearing. They're dropping the F-bomb. They're saying shit. They're calling the host dirty old man, just all this different stuff, and people were sort of outraged. 13 of their 20 concerts that were scheduled were canceled. Churches started formally boycotting them. There's like a thing where like record store employees who were religious wouldn't handle their albums. A conservative MP literally went in Parliament and wished death upon them. Like, these people are like stuff like that. And while all this is going on, there's constant fights at their shows, between all these different subcultures. There's just like casual stories like, then at this point someone got stabbed, and then someone jumped the stage in an attempt to stab Johnny Rotten, and all kinds of stuff like that. They also are, all of this stuff is going on. Just we can keep going because there's 1,000 different things that some people say are publicity stunts, and some are saying it's just the result of them being, like, just intoxicated and just assholes, basically. They were on a plane in which a newspaper reported they just vomited and spat their way through the entire flight. And so finally the EMI is like, we're done, we're dropping you guys. And so they dropped them. So they are now basically without a record label. At around this point in February 1977, Matlock's like, I'm about good. His words, he says that he was ready to leave the band. The story the band puts out and still echoes, including Steve Jones and Johnny Rotten, is that they fired him because he liked the Beatles and was always talking about the Beatles, and they got tired of it, so they were just like, thus. Jones
amazing.
Later says he was a good writer, but he didn't look like a Sex Pistol, and he was always washing his feet. His mom didn't like our songs too. That was his take there. It's like, Matlock attributes it to he and Johnny Rotten couldn't get along and stuff. So, like I said, there's 1,000 of these different stories out there as to why he's there. But anyway, they decide to run with it. Mclaren does, and say they fired him because he didn't like the Beatles, which they thought was a real punk rock thing to do. So he's replaced by Sid Vicious, who is just
who hates the Beatles.
A walking slow suicide / supernova of chaos, I would say, would be how I would describe him. He's got a lot. I mean, the most notable thing to him is he introduced the pogo dance, is what people, have attributed to him, for those that know that dance. He's also sort of like the walking, he's like the id and the ego of the Sex Pistols in some ways. And like I said before, he's in there, he gives them a look. And then from all of this chaos springs this album, which by this point, like I said before, the band is sort of a tighter version of themselves. They go in the studio and they churn this out. As you might have noticed from listening to this album, the lyrics were controversial, including, for example, shitting all over the monarchy, a song very clearly about abortion, which actually, when you listen to it, is kind of an anti-abortion song in some ways, but kind of, because it's talked about, is there's an undercurrent of violence to this monarchy. There's, leftist politics, but almost like at a nihilistic level. They're all over this album and stuff like this. A immediately after this album, they have a press conference where they sign with A&M Records. Or I should say, they sign with A&M Records. Excuse me. And this album comes off on it, but at that point during this press conference, they Rotten's like verbally abusing the staff. Sid is like bleeding all over the offices. That Jones apparently was like hitting on a woman in the ladies' room. Like, it's just chaos. When they're recording this album, there's stories that Queen are nearby, and they're bothering the Queen, like things. Freddie Mercury has to like throw them out of the thing. I could keep going. There's 1,000 different stories like at this point, but every 5 seconds somebody is jumping on the stage. At some point, Johnny Rotten is posed with a Nazi salute. It's like all of like the stuff that people in the 70s did that were basically controversial. They did like all of these things in like a year period. So very long story short, the album is released and it's kind of like both beloved by certain types of people and just hated by other types of people. It's looked at as sort of like the worst underbelly of London youth. After this, they go on a well-known and ridiculous U.S. tour that's mostly dates in the deep south of America, which is remarkable in its own right, to think about that. Vicious is like, of course, deeply addicted to heroin. Mclaren basically said his goal on that U.S. tour was to book redneck bars to provoke hostile situations. They're touring in places like Memphis and Baton Rouge and Dallas. As you might imagine, they're constantly getting into altercations across town. They end up, wandering into San Francisco, which is sort of famously, Rotten gets up on the stage during the encore and says, "You'll get one number and one number only because I'm a lazy bastard," and they play "No Fun" by the Stooges to basically troll the audience. So they're doing stuff like that. And then pretty much right after that, I mean, there's other stuff, but pretty much after that, they break up. And Johnny Rotten goes back to Johnny Lydon. He forms Public Image Limited, which is a band that has like one of the original members of The Clash and another gentleman. They had some hits along the way. The other members have various musical pursuits. And of course, Sid Vicious ends up maybe killing his girlfriends. No one's ever really sure, but he does spend time in jail where he goes through like a cold turkey heroin detox, and then afterwards comes out and, as you might imagine, immediately does a shit ton of heroin and overdoses and dies at the ripe old age of 21 years old.
Jeez.
So
21.
Yeah, there's some lawsuits later. There's the Sex Pistols sort of they're a supernova, right? They burn incredibly bright and then they're gone as soon as they're there. I could do 5 bios with information on the Sex Pistols. I went all over the place to find information. I apologize if I left out your favorite Sex Pistols story. There's a zillion of them. Feel free to share. Yeah, so I mean, I haven't even talked about the influence of the Sex Pistols, which is massive. I mean, besides just the look, there's 1,000 different artists, including almost every iconoclast you can think of. Difficult person in music, love the Sex Pistols, right? So if you're a cranky, difficult person, whether you're, Axl Rose, Noel Gallagher, Ian Curtis of Joy Division, Morrissey, they all loved it. Pete Townsend is another person who loved the Sex Pistols, so they spoke to a certain type of voice.
Yep.
We can build that in, but you know what? Let's just start talking about this album. I think Matt is our first voice. Thoughts?
Thank you, sir. Can I have another? This album's awesome. This is a fun... The beginning riff... Well, let me say this first. I remember last week I was saying that Aerosmith, like I could see like Guns N' Roses in that. This is Guns N' Roses. I mean, full-blown, like...
Sure.
That opening guitar riff in Holidays in the Sun is totally like a fast-paced Guns N' Roses song, and it was immediately, noticeable by me. I didn't really know this album much. I knew God Save the Queen. I knew Anarchy in the UK. That was pretty much it. But I didn't really recognize many of these other songs, and I just love this.
Wow,
This is
really?
this. Yeah, I didn't know a whole lot about this. I probably heard stuff.
So
here and
you
there,
didn't know this album?
No. I know.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. It's just I never listened to. I mean, I always knew of it, and I probably heard pieces of it here and there, but never really I can't say I knew this album going into this week. And this is an awesome album. The guitar sounds were like so energetic, so upfront, and just great riffs. Like I was surprised at how riff heavy this was. Thinking it was going to be, I don't know what the word it would be. For a punk record, I was expecting I want to say more simplicity, but this is a relatively simple album. It's not like it's complex, but I don't know. I just wasn't expecting the powerful riffs that I was getting here for some reason. I don't really know why. It was just but it was awesome. It was just a kick-ass rock record from start to finish. And there's not a ton of variety here. I would say that there's a couple of places like I think Pretty Vacant was kind of a more of a unique sounding song, or a little different with the structure of it, but again, it's not terribly out of whack. I thought EMI, the end of EMI, reminded me of Roadrunner. That actually sounded like a very similar call and response thing to Roadrunner, for sure. But this is just this is like the Clash. This is highly energetic. There's a ton of attitude, even more so than like Johnny Rotten's voice is just really angry, and by the second song, Liar comes on, and I was playing it in front of my family, and he just goes to that part, like fucking shit, fucking over and over again, and we're like, oh, I gotta turn this off, I can't play this in front of my kid. That might have been the first song I think that we've come to in this run that was like just blatantly expletives, just all over the place. And so that certainly, in addition to the to the image and probably antics of the band, having just the F word thrown out all over the place, left and right, probably upset a lot of people. But yeah, this is I loved it. Yes, John, it did. Lots of other bands and artists after this, just took this and ran with it, with this template, and not just with the music, but also with the image and all that stuff that you were talking about. So, very fun record, great rock, very hard, heavy, rock album. Not like metal heavy, but just like very powerful rock, and it's great.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is an essential album to listen to if you have any interest in the history of music and punk rock, especially. I had heard this album before, but it's been a long time. Is this the best one album band that we will cover? I mean, I didn't research this, but this is like an essential question. Like, what other one band albums?
Well, you need to, in order to fill that category, you need to have only one album. Yeah. And there's not a ton of artists that have that, you know.
So maybe in the running for that. The main
Derek and the Dominos, maybe is the only other band I can think of we covered that might be in there.
That would be one. Yeah.
This album is better than I remember. It's like John said, it's the wellspring from which every freaking punk rock band in the future comes from. The anger, the political lyrics at times, the social commentary, and most importantly, I think the delivery, right? I think Johnny Rotten's voice is great on this album. I forgot how good it is. I love the power and the anger that he comes through, and that fast delivery. That's kind of the blueprint for punk rock, in my opinion. There are very catchy songs on this album. I love when they're being political and anarchic, like on God Save the Queen and Anarchy in the UK. I think those songs stand above a lot of the other ones. Bodies too. I think that is just like kind of a fascinating song. Like we said, it's about abortion, and I think he says fuck 5 times or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's just very chaotic. I think those types of songs and Holidays in the Sun kind of stand above the others in a lyrical content mode. This was another album I listened, read the lyrics as I was listening to it on the re-listen, and sometimes they're not really, they're not Patti Smith lyrics, but they are kind of straight and to the point in the way that the Modern Lovers lyrics were. They're talking about liars, they're talking about being 17 and then EMI dropping them from them. So they're not deep, like introspective lyrics in that sense. They're not doing a lot of metaphors or things like that. It's pretty straightforward, straight ahead punk rock, and that doesn't take away from it, but they're not like they're not like even like Wire or something like that in terms of depth. But you can't help but kind of love the spirit of this album, and as fun as it is to hear John recount like kind of the craziness that ensues, it kind of comes through on this album. It's amazing they even made one album in terms of how chaotic they were. It sounds like they couldn't even like keep it together to tour consistently, or without getting in fights. But I respect this album. I enjoy it. I don't like love it, but it's hard to deny the like impact and kind of effervescence of it. So it's fun. I guess I'll put it that. It's fun in like a Tasmanian devil, let's fuck shit up sort of way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember a time in my life where like I wasn't familiar with this album because it's it's the ultimate. I mean, if you're introduced right, you like may stumble into a punk band, but the first thing somebody told you at a certain point, right? Mm-hmm. Especially when I start listening to punk music, is they say, okay, you listen to that, go listen to the Sex Pistols and the Ramones. Like that's the first thing to do. It's like, okay, now I'm going to get my education, right? Like what are the scenes in the modern band? And then you go backwards and you're like, all right, so now time to listen to Sex Pistols and, Ramones, and now I can dovetail into stuff like The Clash, and then you can see how you feel about like Black Flag and Minor Threat and Dead Kennedys, right? See if you want to go down that way, and Bad Religion, and you keep following it, right? Or at least at that time. And you got to remember, this was like probably in the early 90s, right? So like the other bands that you would think of, right, that could come later would be part of that journey for others, but at that point they weren't there. And that's of course the journey that bands like Green Day, right, and Bad Religion, and any of these bands you can think of that became punk band, Rancid, right, like stuff like
something like 182, right?
Yeah, although I would always say they came more from like the Descendants and stuff like that pop punk. They take the pop punky sound, but yes, I'm sure they were delving into the same stuff. But certainly Green Day. I mean, hell, Billy Joe Armstrong even sounds like this, right, on the early Green Day albums. I can't stress enough how much singing about these controversial things is so different than and singing at it from a standpoint of like being a working class pissed off person. Like that's not the take. It's almost hip hop in some ways when you think about it. It's like the Sex Pistols share a hell of a lot more in common with NWA than they do with other British, rock acts, right? Which I think is why they were so appalling, because they bring that sort of energy all the way down to like openly singing about anarchy in a way where you don't feel that they're faking it. You feel like that it's like something they've considered because of the life. They're writing songs like Pretty Vacant, I mean, which is an awesome guitar riff, but also a really, really well constructed song. And Johnny Rotten's a good lyricist, and he's a smart guy too, underneath all of the bluster. God saved, I mean, there's few sets of lyrics that are more pretty impressive than like God Save the Queen, She Ain't No Human Being, and There's No Future in England's Dreaming. I mean, that hits you right over the head. That puts you right in the place, doesn't it, in terms of like what it was like to be there and sort of be marginalized and stuff. And and I know that they don't consider themselves a political band as much as they are like social commentators / general like nihilism, kind of is how they looked at it. But Yeah, I mean, it's an awesome album. It's hard for me to believe anybody hasn't heard this album because it's just so much a part of my seminal music listening, and it's pretty much anytime I ever talk to anybody who has been into punk music, I mean, it's been a part of their life since seemingly the cradle of their musicdom, and there's still people, I'm sure, that are discovering this album like today, and it's going to be influential on them. Well, right, like Matt is, for example, but I'm talking more like people in their formative music years.
It's so weird too, because it just goes back to that thing. Because of course I've known of this album, and I knew a couple of the songs, and I knew it's this amazing thing, and I'm not surprised that I loved it so much. But again, it goes back to that whole thing about like, what was I only had so much money. What was I gonna spend my money on listening to? And at one point I bought the first Ramones album, just because I felt like buying it that day. So
this is how you and I are so different. Like, the idea of going and paying $15 for this CD was in no way how I imagined getting this album. This CD was like put on a cassette tape for me.
Oh yeah.
Or I think the second copy I got of it was for like $1 at like a shit record store in like, I want to say like North Jersey, maybe. Like, in no way did I ever think of walking to like Tower Records and finding, never mind the Bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols. It was like, it was incomprehensible. And I don't get me wrong, I shopped at those for other albums, but it was like incomprehensible for me to shop for like punk or ska records like in Tower Records, right? That's why when like the whole stuff broke, right? Like, Green Day on the one end, and then like No Doubt and Sublime. It was such a foreign concept for me because I was used to like diving through like bins at like the Princeton Record Exchange to find this stuff, not like Tower Records.
Yeah, and it's like, I never had anybody make a mix for me. It's, again, it never crossed my path like that. And the time that I did go bin diving, like at these blowout sales and stuff, like if I found this, and I could have got it for like $1.50, I would have probably gotten it. I just didn't come across it. So it's like some of the stuff is just for me. It's just by happenstance. It's just the scenario that I'm in. But
the sliding door scenario of what album you chose on that day.
Exactly. Thank you, John. That's how I got Tommy, right? I was in the what is it, Sam Goody or something was going out of business, and I got like Tommy for like a couple bucks. I was like, I'll take Tommy. Why not?
But
that's how I got Aerosmith's greatest hits. Like it's just I wasn't searching for that.
The Sex Pistols would be appalled if you got their album at the same place that you got Tommy and Aerosmith's greatest hits.
John, let's be honest. They would have been appalled at every aspect of my life. Let's be honest. Like anything that I do, they
I'm not
gonna
go that far. But I'm saying like that's the beautiful thing about it. Like you weren't supposed to find this. Like you could have, but it would have been.
This is an album you
like,
need to find in an alley, really.
Yeah, hell beat up, and I can't play it on my CD player.
Well, it would. It's like it would have been like watching porn in the library. You know what I mean? Like you're not supposed to do that. You know what I mean? If you're gonna watch porn, you know what I mean? It's supposed to be in a place that's seedier. You know what I mean? Amongst others in it.
Quite the analogy.
Not like, well, it's the same idea though. You know what I mean? It's this like sort of this darker, sort of dirtier deal, and you're not going to blend it with like a mainstream place where yes, you can access other media, but this isn't the media that you're supposed to get there. So so. Yeah, I mean, obviously, high recommend.
Yeah.
I mean, this album's famous and should be for a reason. It's the definition of essential if you like any sort of punk or punk adjacent music or post punk or hell, anything.
John, do you like this? Do you like either of you guys? Do you guys like this better than the Clash album that we covered? Or the Clash's albums? Like, how would you compare this to the Clash?
I like the Clash's album a
I also
little bit
like
better.
the Clash more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I felt strongly one way or the other. I like them both quite a bit.
I mean, they're both awesome albums. So I don't know if I have to pick one or like I just say I really like both, and I don't have to pick one or the other. So yeah.
Yeah.
They're coupled together for me too because one begat the other, and I also throw the Ramones self-titled before it because that's also these are like the Mount Rushmore of punk albums. So
yeah, we should be doing the Ramones soon too. I think
pretty soon.
Yeah, and I will have to say the first time I did hear Anarchy in the UK, which is like that's easily the song that I knew the most off of this. It's God, such a great riff. But the first time I heard that was a live version by Motley Crue on their compilation album Decade of Decadence. And I was like, that's a pretty good song. I didn't know Motley Crue
wonder
had a
how
song like that.
I'm sure Johnny Rotten probably hated Motley Crue would be my guess.
Yes. Yeah. For various reasons. Well, keep in mind he does hate all music, so except for Roadrunner. So that's the only song he's ever liked.
The ones that he's mentioned he likes. The Sex Pistols are also a pretty interesting band in terms of like their B-sides and randoms, because they have a lot of different stuff floating around, including a lot of covers of songs that we've talked about and we like. So I would definitely recommend checking out some of their B-sides. Some of their stuff is atrocious, but some of it is also really good. And they've monetized like every little scrap of whatever the Sex Pistols did. So it's like when Tupac, when they just threw everything together from the wow, that was profound underneath to like the what even is this? There's a little bit of that with the Sex Pistols too.
It's so weird too, because on Best Ever Albums, even though they only have technically one studio album, they list 13 different albums that they have here, which are mostly just compilations and live stuff like that. So so they must have a bunch of other they have a bunch of other stuff out there. I didn't really find a whole lot.
They have a zillion greatest hits, live, odds and ends, B-sides, hidden gems, stuff that like Sid Vicious did by himself, which was But what you really need is this and some of the B-sides. Yeah.
They also have they have a album called Kiss This. and there's another one that's, what is it? It's we have come for your children, and come is CUM. It's like, okay. So yeah,
there you go.
Provocateurs for sure.
They are.
They absolutely are. But yeah, listen to this one if you haven't heard it before. If you're under the age of 18 and you're trying to build your music collection, you really need to like listen to this, and probably you really also need to talk to somebody who can tell you about why this is what it is. And because it's very important. In some ways it's as important as some of the albums that are considered to be foundational from the 60s and the 70s. It's as important in its own way as those albums, and probably as important as something that gets held up like a totem now, like say Nevermind by Nirvana or something. It's in that class. Yep. So